Welcome to Gender Chronicles. Dive into the fascinating world of gender dynamics as we unravel the threads of tradition, change, and identity. Together we'll explore the intricate relationships between the sexes, empowering you to navigate them with clarity, confidence, and wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, are men guilty until proven innocent in today's world? Patriarchal Crimes Against Women dives deep into a dystopian reality where Josh, a devoted husband and father, is unexpectedly arrested and convicted of vague charges like male privilege and oppression. In this dystopian nightmare, Josh encounters thousands of other men imprisoned for violating feminist sensibilities, crimes as ambiguous as offending female sensitivities. This gripping story explores the consequences of radical feminism, the erosion of due process, and the rise of a culture where masculinity is under constant scrutiny. Okay, let us begin. Patriarchal Crimes Against Women. In the heart of Westernaria, a nation veiled in the opaque shroud of an omnipresent feminist regime, lived Josh, a devoted husband and father of 4. His life was compelling evidence of diligence and familial commitment, his days a mosaic of labor and love, constructing a sanctuary for his family. Yet, beneath the veneer of normalcy, an imperceptible current of authority flowed. A totalitarian feminist apparatus whose presence was as intangible as it was absolute. One unremarkable morning, as dawn's light filtered through the curtains, Josh was roused not by the familiar embrace of his wife's greeting, but by the cold, unyielding knock of authority. Men in indistinct uniforms stood at his threshold, their expressions inscrutable. "Josh Mercer," one intoned, "you are under arrest for a patriarchal crime against Westernaria's women." The words hung in the air, alien and incomprehensible. "A patriarchal crime?" Josh echoed, bewilderment knitting his brow. "What does that mean? What have I done?" The officers remained silent, their faces betraying no hint of emotion or explanation. They escorted him from his home, past the wide-eyed gazes of his children and the silent tears of his wife, into a vehicle that seemed to materialize from the ether. Thus began Josh's descent into a labyrinthine judicial system, a maze without walls, where corridors twisted upon themselves, leading to chambers that defied logic and reason. He was shuffled between interrogators whose questions were as vague as their identities, each inquiry a riddle wrapped in enigma. "Who is the judge?" Josh inquired during one such session. "That is not for you to know," came the curt reply. "Who prosecutes my case? Who stands in judgment? These are matters beyond your concern." Days bled into weeks, time losing its linear progression within the confines of his cell. The walls, a uniform grey, bore no marks to distinguish one day from the next. His pleas for clarity met only with the echo of his own voice, reverberating in the emptiness. In the rare moments he was permitted interaction, it was with fellow inmates, men who, like him, bore the nebulous accusation of patriarchal crimes. "Do you know why you're here?" Josh asked one, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes. The man shook his head. "No. They said I committed a crime of male privilege, but no one will tell me what I did." "How long have you been here?" "I don't know. Time is different here." The guards, ever watchful, offered no solace. Their whispers, though hushed, carried the weight of judgment. "That's him," one murmured to another. "The dangerous one. What did he do?" "I don't know, but it must have been severe." Their eyes followed him with a mixture of fear and disdain, as if proximity to him might taint them with his unseen transgressions. In the solitude of his cell, Josh's mind became both refuge and tormentor. He retraced the steps of his life, examining each memory, each action, searching for the elusive sin that had ensnared him. Was it a word spoken in jest? A glance misinterpreted? The ambiguity gnawed at his sanity, each unanswered question a thorn in his psyche. Letters from his wife arrived sporadically, their tone shifting from confusion to despair, and finally to resignation. "Josh," one read, "they say you are guilty of heinous acts. I want to believe in your innocence, but the children, they are suffering. We must think of their future. I have filed for divorce." The finality of her words was a blow more crushing than any physical assault. His family, his anchor to reality, was severed, adrift in a sea of societal condemnation. In the rare instances he was brought before a tribunal, the proceedings were shrouded in obscurity. Figures cloaked in shadow presided over the hearings, their faces obscured, voices modulated to a monotone. "Josh," one began, "you stand accused of perpetuating patriarchal dominance. How do you plead?" "I don't understand the charge," Josh replied, desperation tinging his voice. "What have I done?" "Ignorance is no defense," the voice intoned. "Your actions have upheld systemic oppression. You'll soon get your day in court." "What actions? Please tell me what I've done." But no answers were forthcoming. Only the cold presumption of guilt and the pre-sentence, which was a pre-trial indeterminate confinement, the duration of which was known only to the unseen arbiters of his fate. In the dim recesses of the prison, Josh encountered others whose spirits had been eroded by the same inscrutable system. Men who spoke in hushed tones of lives dismantled, of identities erased by the amorphous accusations that clung to them like a second skin. "They say I was oppressive," one murmured, eyes vacant. "But I loved my wife. I cherished my daughters. How could that be a crime?" "I taught my son to be strong and hard-working," another whispered. "To be a man, is that wrong?" The questions hung in the stale air, unanswered, unanswerable. As days turned to months, or perhaps years, time's passage rendered meaningless within the prison's unchanging routine, Josh felt the erosion of his sense of self. The man who had once been a pillar of his community, a father, a husband, was now a hollow shell, defined only by the enigmatic crime that had stripped him of his identity. In the end, it was not the physical confinement that broke him, but the relentless assault on his understanding of reality. The constant insinuation of guilt without the anchor of specific transgression, the trial of Josh Mercer. Josh sat in the dimly lit courtroom, his wrists bound in steel cuffs that dug into his skin. The walls loomed high and narrow, lined with dark wood panels that seemed to close in on him like a tightening noose. The air smelled faintly of paper and sweat. Rows of women filled the gallery, their eyes unblinking and fixed on him with expressions ranging from disdain to something resembling pity. At the front, presiding over the court, was Judge Vera Callista, her stern gaze peering out from beneath thick glasses. She radiated an austere authority, her grey robes flowing around her like shadows. Her hair was a severe bun, as if strands out of place might betray weakness. Beside her sat a 12-member jury, 11 of whom were women. The single man, seated at the end, seemed intent on making himself invisible, his shoulders hunched, his eyes lowered. Josh's mouth was dry and his hands trembled. He had tried to prepare himself for this day, for the parade of accusations he could not comprehend. Still, nothing could have fortified him against the presence of Prosecutor Gynopolis, a name whispered in prison corridors like the name of a god whose wrath could not be escaped. No one had ever seen Gynopolis's face, and today was no exception. The prosecutor stood shrouded behind a high, shadowed podium, visible only as a silhouette, a disembodied voice dripping with menace and conviction. When he spoke, the room stiffened. "Josh Mercer!" Gynopolis's voice boomed, echoing across the chamber. "You stand accused of committing a grave patriarchal crime against women, a crime so severe that society demands nothing less than your total removal from its midst." Josh swallowed hard, his heart pounding against his ribs. The prosecutor's voice lowered but gained intensity. "You may deny it, many do, but denial, as we know, is the language of the oppressor. The tyrant always cries innocence when confronted with his deeds." Josh gripped the edge of the table. "What deeds? What am I accused of specifically?" His voice cracked as he tried to steady himself. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge's gavel struck once, silencing the room. "Order," she commanded. Then she turned to Josh with a gaze that seemed to peel back his skin. "The evidence against you will be presented. Your defense, if it can be called that, may respond." Josh flinched. He already knew no defense could penetrate this wall. Gynopolis's voice resonated again. "This man, this father, this husband, lived a life of unchecked patriarchal privilege. The evidence of his guilt is woven into the very fabric of his home and community. We shall begin with his wife's testimony." Josh's breath caught. His wife. She had been questioned while he languished in a cell, helpless to respond. She reported under oath that Josh Mercer maintained absolute control over their finances, that she had to ask permission to spend even the smallest sum of money. She testified that he pressured her into bearing children, prioritizing his legacy over her aspirations and independence. "That's a lie!" Josh shouted before he could stop himself. Judge Callista's gavel thundered down. "Silence, Mr. Mercer." "But it's not true. My wife and I shared—" "Enough!" Her voice was sharp as a blade. Gynopolis's voice rose in triumph. "And the children, Your Honor. Let us speak of the children. They described a household steeped in traditional gender roles, where boys were taught to dominate and girls to submit. His sons reported that they were encouraged to show strength, while his daughters were reminded to be obedient. These are not my words, but those recorded in sworn testimonies. Josh's vision blurred. His children, they had said that? Or had their words been twisted? The room spun as he tried to make sense of it. And what of the neighbors? Gynopolis continued, relentless. They spoke of a man who projected authority, who was respected but feared. A man who commanded his household with unyielding expectations of hierarchy and discipline. Even acts of so-called kindness were tainted by the subtle imposition of control. Josh wanted to scream, to deny it all, but he sat frozen, trapped by the invisible chains of this court. Your Honor, Gynopolis said, his voice now silky, venomous. This is not just the story of one man. It is the story of a system of dominance embodied in flesh and blood. This court does not merely judge Josh Mercer as an individual, it judges the legacy of oppression he represents. The jury members leaned forward, their eyes gleaming. It was clear that Gynopolis's words had sunk deep into their bones. Judge Callista nodded. Mr. Mercer, do you wish to speak in your defense? Josh's voice wavered. I love my family. I have always supported my wife and children. I have never raised a hand against them or spoken to them with cruelty. I worked tirelessly to provide for them. Everything I did was for them. A familiar refrain, Gynopolis sneered. The oppressor often cloaks himself in the language of love to disguise his tyranny. Josh looked to the jury, searching for a glimmer of understanding, but all he saw was skepticism. The judge leaned forward. And yet, Mr. Mercer, love without equality is nothing but servitude wrapped in affection. This court is not moved by your protestations. Josh's last hope flickered out. The words he longed to say, that he was a good man, that he had done nothing immoral or illegal, felt small and meaningless here. The machinery of the court ground forward, indifferent to his humanity. As the judge raised her gavel, Josh glimpsed the guards stationed along the walls, their hands already on their batons. He saw the faces of the jury, impassive, resolute, and in that moment he understood. This trial had never been about evidence. It had been about narrative, about ideology. The gavel fell. This court finds the defendant guilty as charged. Josh's breath caught. He tried to stand, but the guards seized him. The room erupted in murmurs of satisfaction. Sentencing will be determined at a later date, Judge Callista announced. Gynopolis's voice echoed one final time. Justice has spoken. And as Josh was led away, his legs buckling beneath him, he saw his wife and children in the gallery. Their faces were unreadable, masks of sorrow or guilt or fear. He called out to them, but their eyes did not meet his. The doors closed behind him. Darkness, silence. The echoes of Gynopolis's voice lingered in his ears, and Josh knew he would never escape them. Back in jail, Josh sat on the cold concrete floor of his cell, his back pressed against the damp wall, his knees drawn up to his chest. The dim light bulb above flickered faintly, casting shadows that danced like mocking specters. His mind wandered, not forward but back, clawing through the wreckage of his past to find the pieces of himself that still felt real. Bootstraps, the word haunted him now, like an epitaph carved on his soul. He had lived by it, yanked himself upward with them, clawed his way from dirt to dignity. His father had given him nothing except warnings about failure and a worn toolbox with half-rusted wrenches. And yet Josh had built. He had built with his hands, his sweat, his calluses. He could still see the splinters lodged under his fingernails as he hammered the first beams of the house that stood now like a monument to futility, occupied by strangers who whispered lies about his legacy. It had started with nothing, less than nothing. Nights spent on floors in apartments he could barely afford, eating canned beans and stale bread to save enough for the down payment on his first truck, taking extra shifts, night work, side jobs. He'd crawl out of bed before sunrise, pour coffee down his throat, and press his shoulders under the weight of yet another 12-hour day. And why? What was the point of it all? To be worthy. That's what he told himself through every ache and exhaustion. He would earn the right to be noticed, to be admired, not by men, not by bosses or neighbors, but by a woman who would see his labor and find it good. And he had. He had earned love, or so he thought. He remembered how he felt when his wife first looked at him with awe. Awe not for who he was, but for what he could provide. A house, security, protection. Her love felt like vindication, He wasn't weak. He wasn't useless. He was necessary. And now, patriarchal privilege. That's what Judge Callista had called it. The invisible inheritance he had supposedly drawn from the well of oppression. It was absurd. If there was a well, he had never tasted a drop of it. He looked around at the other inmates, shattered men with hollow eyes and slumped shoulders. Most of them barely spoke. They sat in corners, muttering, sometimes weeping. Their silence said more than words ever could. There was Jeff, the former entrepreneur. Jeff had been sentenced 2 months before Josh, accused of leveraging systemic dominance to build his wealth. Jeff had poured every hour of his life into his business, missing birthdays, working through holidays, breaking his back to create something lasting. And yet the judge's words rang in his ears. You built nothing. It was handed to you by a society that tilts the scales. Your success is theft. Josh had watched Jeff crumble after that, his pride ground to dust under the weight of those accusations. He hadn't spoken in weeks. He just stared at the wall, as though trying to see through it into a world where reason still existed. But reason was dead here. Josh rubbed his palms together, feeling the roughness of the calluses that still lingered. They were scars of effort, symbols of sacrifice. But here they were seen as evidence of guilt. These hands, the prosecutor had said, built not a home, but a prison for your wife and children, a cage adorned with comfort to mask the chains. He shook his head. He had loved them. He had sweated for them. And yet his labor was now treated as violence, his sacrifices as weapons. He thought about the loans he'd taken to build their home, the fear that gnawed at him every month when the payment was due, the panic when work slowed down and the checks weren't enough. How he'd taken extra jobs, shoveling snow, cutting lawns, hauling junk, just to scrape together enough to keep the roof over their heads. And when he finally paid it off, early, months early, he had stood in front of the house and wept. Not because of the money, but because it meant the house was theirs, his family's, safe and untouchable. Untouchable. That word stung now. Nothing was untouchable here. Not the walls he built, not the wife he adored, not the children he kissed goodnight. They were all gone now, untethered from him, drifting in a sea of accusations and lies. And what had they told Gynopolis? What had his children said under the prosecutor's watchful gaze? Did they even understand what they were saying? Or had they simply repeated words fed to them, words laced with fear and doubt? He clenched his fists. It didn't matter. The verdict was already written before the trial began. Gynopolis had seen to that. He was famous for it, for turning doubt into certainty, for spinning ambiguity into guilt. They called him the architect of guilt, the weaver of crimes. And here, guilt was a currency. Josh thought again of Jeff and the others, the men who had been stripped of everything they'd built, the men who whispered about re-education programs and patriarchal detox centers, where they were taught to despise the very instincts that had driven them to succeed. He wondered if that would be his fate. Would they make him confess? Force him to recite the litany of sins they had ascribed to him? Would he have to renounce the very life he had built? Or would he resist? Would he cling to his innocence, even as the walls closed in? But innocence meant nothing here. Truth was malleable, shaped and molded to fit the narrative. Guilt wasn't proven, it was assumed. Josh stared at his hands again. These hands had built a home. They had held his children. They had wiped away tears and carried burdens. And now in this place they were weapons, tools of oppression. He closed his eyes. Somewhere outside this prison, his wife and children lived their lives, free from his shadow. Did they miss him? Did they grieve him? Or had they already moved on, carried away by the tide of judgment? The thought crushed him, but he wouldn't cry. Not here, not in front of the guards who watched him like an animal in a cage. Instead, he leaned his head back against the wall and whispered to himself, I built something beautiful. And the walls whispered back, and that is why you must be destroyed. Thank you for tuning in. If you found this video thought-provoking or inspiring, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to stay connected. Got a topic on your mind? Share your ideas with us. We're always eager to explore what matters to you.